Hello and welcome to our Gem Pursuit. My name is Matthew Weldon and I'm joined in our magical and mysterious pursuit to the world of antique and vintage jewellery by my trusty co-host Alyce Ketcher. Hello Alyce.
Good morning everybody.
This week we are looking at a jewellery movement which was defined by one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. While pieces from this time can be diverse in style, there are a number of motifs you can recognise, such as elaborate gemstone patterns, romantic shapes, cameos and beautiful parures. Alyce, would you like to tell us what we're talking about today?
So today we're breaking up the Victorian period into sections for you, and we're starting off with section 1, which is the Romantic era.
Excellent. Let's get started. So I know for some of our listeners, they will have noticed that one of our first series, we did kind of 3 episodes as we figured out kind of how to record a podcast basically. But our second full series was about the different periods in jewellery. And one of those was the Victorian era. Now, the thing to remember, the reason we're going to break down the Victorian era over this little mini series, which is going to have 3 episodes, is because Queen Victoria, or the Victorian era, was from 1837 to 1901, which is obviously a very long time. And as you said to me just before we came on air, Alyce, if you went back, 64 years from today, would take us back to 1940. Is that right? No, 1960. Mathematics coming through there. 1960. But there's no way that you could group all of those eras into one era. And the reason it's really called the Victorian era, that long time frame, is because she was there for so long. But there's 3 distinct eras within that era, isn't there?
There is. So the way that I like to explain this to anyone, especially listeners who have been with us for a while, or if you're just joining us now, is decades in themselves of time can have huge things that happen, and they change kind of the course of fashion, they change the course of architecture, even product labeling can change, or product design can change in such a small period of time. And it would be a disservice to kind of like lump everything in together. Imagine like taking the 60s, 70s and 80s and going, those 3 decades themselves, the jewellery is all the same. It's really not. The 60s, 70s and 80s have hugely diverse fashions in comparison to today. So we're breaking up the Victorian period into the 3 sections. It's widely known in the antique jewellery world that it is broken up into these 3 sections. However, when we did our first Choose Your Era season 3, the eras that we did were literally overviews of full sections of time, the Victorian period being very large because of the long reign of Queen Victoria. But as was said back then, she was a young queen who grew into an older queen, Matthew.
Classic line. Love that. Love that one.
And during that time, like during her lifespan, her tastes changed and things happened in the world that completely changed her view on the world as well. So we start off with the young Queen Victoria, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and this is the Victorian Romantic era, which starts in 1837 when she is crowned Queen of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and it's vital to realise how influential she was to each of these, periods, and her feelings at the time, what she was doing, what she was going through, that came through in the fashion and in the jewellery. Her personality and her fashion sense and her interests and what she did in her life permeated right through each period of the Victorian era.
And so, like with her in particular, we see, so just so that we know where we're going with the 3 episodes that are going to kind of encapsulate the Victorian period. We're going to be doing the romantic period, and then it's the grand period, and then it's the aesthetic period. So these are the 3 episodes. Starting off with Queen Victoria being so young, she was a single monarch when she took the throne in 1837. And you can imagine many of the eligible aristocrats, princes, cousins of the time were throwing their hat into the ring because she inherited a vast fortune, a property portfolio, and also was basically at the time the empress of the world. Like, so many resources available to her. And, you know, the thought of her being a young woman also was extremely appealing as well, because can I marry a woman and be able to then, at this period of time, control her and be able to have control over all of those assets which we've just listed? So she really was in a dangerous situation for herself if she made the wrong decision.
Yes, but of course, as we know, in this romantic era, her courtship of Prince Albert was fundamental to her life. And shortly after she inherited the throne, she actually became engaged, of course. You know, and we talk about her engagement ring with a serpent jewellery, and there's an episode on the serpent motif. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes, and you go into, you know, a lot of detail in that episode about the meaning of the serpent and why it was important. But I think, you know, throughout this early part of her reign, there was a few key things, both technologically, socially, which give the background for the jewellery of this era, I think. So, and one that I think is really interesting is something that we take for granted now today. We were away yesterday, you and I, looking at a private collection that was for sale. But travel was a key element of the Romantic era. And I think fundamental to this, it's important to realise that before this time period, travel was quite difficult.
Paint us a picture of what it's like during the Romantic era, Matthew.
Right. Well, I wouldn't consider myself an artist now, Alyce, but I'll do my best. But what you have to think about, railways and trains, where people were obsessed with rail travel. What you have to remember is that in the absence of rail travel at that time, distances were big. So previously going to UK to Italy, or from France to Germany, or from Italy to Spain, these were big trips. Required a lot of preparation, a lot of planning, a lot of time. But with your introduction of extended rail travel, they became much quicker. But what it meant, how it influenced the jewellery, is that people went on their travelling around Europe. They'd see different designs, different architecture, and this would inspire the jewellery. And they'd also pick up jewellery from these places, and they'd bring it back either to wherever they're from. And that then would inspire jewellery like that to be created. It's
also the opening up of ideas culturally as well, because in another one of our episodes, we talk about tokens of love and we talk about the hidden language of flowers. And it is believed that the hidden language of flowers, which is used heavily, almost as much as the Bible during the Victorian period, especially during the Romantic era, was an idea that was actually adopted from Istanbul, so from the Turkish. So it's the travel opens up ideas, thought process, cultures, and we basically learn to adopt new ways of living. So, and also techniques in jewellery as well expand. So it really is an interesting time in her empire that all of this is happening. But remembering as well that she is so young. So she takes the throne and she's single. She's also been raised extremely sheltered. So, you know, I'm sure a few of you have watched the Queen Victoria movie with Emily Blunt in it. But up until her uncle dies and she becomes queen, her mother insists that one of her carers, one of Queen Victoria's carers, actually accompany her up and down the stairs so that she doesn't fall down the stairs and hurt herself. So she's really, really sheltered. She has very little friends. She plays by herself. She's kept very isolated in order to make sure that she is healthy and fit to take over the kingdom. So it's quite a lonely existence for her, and her becoming queen kind of allows her to flourish and then allows her to actually enter the dating scene, which I'm sure for someone who's been, sheltered as much as she was, courtship would have been something maybe quite daunting to her and extremely foreign to her. So this is where we kind of see the etiquette of the Victorian romantic age come to the forefront as well. And it's really funny because she actually does become quite rigid with her rules of etiquette.
In her dating.
Not just in her dating, but as you go through all of the other parts of the Victorian era, she becomes really rigid in rule setting of etiquette. Like, she's decorum and etiquette to her, and the way that things are done specifically in the Victorian era are really, really important. So, for instance, like if you're dating today, you might go to a bar, you might meet someone and they might flirt with you. Well, in the Victorian era, that is poo-poo. No, not allowed at all. Okay. So I'm going to, I've looked through quite a few of the etiquette books. There are hundreds of them in the Victorian period, hundreds. Right. I'm not talking like there's a little book here and a little book there. There is so much information on etiquette to do with courtship, marriage, literally books that say what to do for nearly every aspect of your life. In particular, there's ones for gentlemen and there's ones for women. So, of course, the two roles are extremely different. But for men, it states not to carry your politeness too far. So it's basically saying you can be polite to an unmarried lady if you're unmarried, but do not take it too far as to give them the wrong impression. So otherwise you're seen as
in interest in them.
Well, you're seen as having an interest, but also that you're not gentlemanly if you do that, if you give women the wrong impression.
I think that rule probably still applies today.
I don't know. You wouldn't be shunned from society if you didn't do it. And then it says, do not flirt with every woman you meet.
Again, not a bad rule of thumb.
And once you are engaged, it says men are to show their fiancé constant attention and never flirt or deviate one's eye from the prize.
Do they use the phrase from the prize?
Yes.
Do they?
Very often women are considered the prize. And then in terms of engagement, right? So if you're engaged to someone, you're not allowed to have any kind of PDA, no hand holding, hand touching, no physical contact is supposed to take place between the two betrothed or anybody. It's not, unless you're dancing in a formal setting where there is a dance, you're not allowed to be touching each other. But if you're engaged to one another, you're allowed to exchange gifts. And the gifts that you're allowed to exchange are locks of hair, portraits, and other things like fans and books and things like that. But it's a general rule that you're never allowed to accept a present from a gentleman unless you are engaged. Otherwise, a woman will give the man the wrong impression. And it goes on and on and on. It goes so far as to kind of give women ideas on what colors they should be wearing to show that they have interest, how to hold their fans. Like there's one particular rule, and you would have noticed that sometimes in stock we have dance cards. So women and men may be in a ballroom situation and there's going to be dancing. Now, if I've been invited to the dance by the host of the house and I know the host, then I can only speak to people who I have been formally introduced to previously or whoever the host formally introduces me to. However, I can dance with anyone. So people can come and dance with you on the dance floor, but you're not allowed to talk to them while you're dancing to each other if you have not formally met. So it's like very...
God, you need to be up early to keep on top of all that. But the reason they exist is so people know where they stand, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's protection, really. It has a lot to do with the protection of women's virtue, I guess. This is what they believed in the Victorian period, that women's virtue needed to be protected and that it was a prize to be won. So there was this kind of like, you know, this bird dance to try and get the woman's attention, and then her responses needed to be clear so that the male understood where the road was taking them. So it's like the Romantic era, you can tell, has a lot to do. It has a lot of the parallels to her own courtship and her own life and the things that she thought were acceptable during her own courtship.
And you can really see how that starts to come into the jewellery, because with all these, you know, different etiquettes and different rules, there's different jewellery for each of these occasions. You know, you mentioned even locks of hair, like hair jewellery was something you'd see in this period, really popular, super collectible today, actually. And we've got a few pieces, but you know, in our, you know, my time in dealing, I've only seen a handful of really exquisite fully hair jewellery. But I don't know, when I think of, you know, the etiquette and the rules, there's a lot of positives to them, I suppose, that you know what you have to do. But at the same time, I think you just have to be like, you have to be so on top of it, like, wouldn't you? But
well, this is the thing. It becomes an obsession for those who are not married or have unmarried daughters or sons to kind of, number one, understand what the avenue is that you're going to go down, but also the idea of romantic love at this particular time is probably one of the only times where we see it championed in a royal setting. So in a royal setting, we usually see the coming together of two parties who both have something to offer financially to the other, right? Whether it be assets or power or
titles,
land or titles. It's always been about kind of like combining efforts to keep land, money, assets intact, right? This is what it's always been about. When Queen Victoria actually makes her choice, there's plenty of other options for her. She's got all of the options, but this is the first time where sentimentality and love, romantic love, is actually one of the main reasons why she chooses her partner. And it's the reason why today we continue to see jewellery in such a sentimental way. It's this relationship that does it. We don't actually understand that until you actually read how jewellery was used prior to this. But Queen Victoria is fundamental in bringing sentimentality into jewelry.
Yeah, it's only, as you said it there, sometimes you don't realize that these events that happened so long ago really do influence what we do today. It actually reminded me of, the type of shops that we have today, like where you walk in and there's someone there and they serve you, like even that whole idea, and you go in, you can like pick up things and put them down and hold them. That whole idea was all to do with Selfridges, well over like 100 years ago. And before that, shops were not like that at all. So it's just, and that when you talk about, Queen Victoria and her idea of sentimentality and romantic love in this period, it's really impacts all of our lives more than you'd probably think, actually. So thank you for that, Queen Victoria. But another really important element, right? Obviously, the romantic area, the fundamental thing is the romanticism, right? Of course. But there's also, in terms of making the jewellery, there's some really key things that change at this time, which before, as you said, jewellery was a totally different thing. But the technology changed as well in its manufacture or its craft. Prior to 1854, and bearing in mind that this first era of the Victorian era goes up to about 1860, all jewellery was handmade. Everything's handmade. Even chains, like, today you buy chains and you can literally buy them off a ream of, I don't know if you've ever been to the factories where they make these chains.
I've seen the machines like actually just literally sitting there linking and soldering. Yeah. Like it's like a knitting machine, but for gold.
You buy it by the meter. You go in and ask how many meters of chain, if you're a manufacturer, and you buy these chains, right? But prior to that, every single link was done by hand. So if you had a chain, you can be rest assured that someone painstakingly made every single link and fixed it in place. It was all either 22 or 18 karat gold as well prior to this. So if you have a piece of jewelry and you're trying to date, if you've seen kind of, bigger links, if it's a chain, if you're trying to assess whether it's pre kind of 1850 or 1860, it's going to be 18 karat or 22. The other standards come into force. We're talking about jewelry from the UK here, which was one of the biggest productions of jewelry at that time, right? And French was all 18 karat as well. But after that, you start to get 9, 12, 15 karat. 12 you'd rarely see. 15 is a great karat gold.
We've also had like 10 and 13 before in store, but that's from the continent.
Yes. And we did an episode on gold. Which actually
go to the gold episode.
We actually had a 16 karat gold piece once, which I won't get into, but I don't know how that happened. But so that's a really important part. The technology changed around 1854. There was machinery that could cut and stamp settings that was introduced. Now, it wasn't mainstream until really the late 1800s, 1900s, but it was introduced in and around the 1850s, and that was a huge change in the production of jewellery, which happened about this time. So the cultural effects, from Queen Victoria and the Romantic era are super important. Also the technology effects, and indeed the element of travel in social habits was also fundamental at this time. Still to come, we are going to talk about the different styles and types of jewellery that you are likely to come across in the Romantic era of the Victorian period. But first, Alyce, where can people find some examples of these Victorian pieces?
We have a really fabulous website if you're looking to learn more about Victorian jewellery, to actually see what these pieces look like. So if you want to check out our website, it's www.courtville.ie. And if you look under the section in the scroll down, it will state Victorian era pieces. If you click on the link, you'll be able to view everything that we currently have in stock.
Well worth checking those out, but let's get back to the episode.
So when we're talking about the jewellery of this era, I want to kind of go along with the love story timeline of Queen Victoria herself. So with Queen Victoria, she comes to the throne in 1837. Everybody's like, woo, 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 let's woo her. Then she starts getting visits from her cousin, Albert. They keep in touch through writing. He gives her a few pointers. By 1839, they are engaged. And she receives in 1839 a little orange blossom brooch as an engagement gift from him as well. Now, not to mention, she obviously gets an engagement ring as well. Because of etiquette as well, at the time, the monarch has to actually propose to the man because she is the reigning monarch and you cannot ask the monarch to marry you. So she had to ask him. So she asks him, and then he, of course, was ready because he knew that it was going to happen. He then presented her with the engagement ring. Okay, so that's how it went down. Now, she goes on from here, kind of starts her own traditions, right? So when she gets married in 1840, she actually doesn't wear a traditional tiara, which is unusual. She decides to actually have a full parure of orange blossoms, which is mirroring the gift that was given to her by her husband-to-be, or at the end of the day, her husband, for their engagement gift. And the orange blossom is famously known as a wedding flower because it represents fertility. It's one of the only flowers that actually blooms at the same time as it seeds. So it's a very important nod that she gives to her husband. And this goes on and on throughout their courtship, right through what I would consider the honeymoon period for the couple, where they end up having many children, all of whom have posterity that are sitting on thrones throughout Europe today, and change the face of what we consider a normal family relationship. Also during this time, we see the invention of women's magazines. Now, the number one thing that the women's magazines were trying to provide, as written in the magazines themselves, was bringing the palace into your home. So this is where we see her real influence. Like, she's the first influencer, 100%. Magazines want to see what she's wearing, what she's doing, and put them in this magazine and then emulate it and sell the goods throughout the kingdom. And it's really interesting to see how human nature actually hasn't changed very much. The median in the way that we get it out to the public is different, and those whom we want to emulate are different, but the concept is the same, right? It's pretty much exactly what's going on today.
Yeah, I mean, it's just through a screen today. And actually, we've had some of those old magazines here and copies of them and things, and they're really quite modern in a way. She also did some pretty interesting things at this time, which, you know, will really help you date the jewellery if you think you have something from this. So something that we got the other day actually was a silver Scottish bracelet with kind of polished granite in it. Really cool bracelet. When we were trying to date it, all you have to do is look at the fact that Balmoral Estate, which is obviously still in the royal family today and has a lot of interesting stories about that, one of which that the heating used to be kept on at the whole time because the Queen Elizabeth's mother liked to stay there and she just wanted the heating on the whole time just in case she'd go. But it cost some crazy amount annually. But the royal family got that because Queen Victoria went to Scotland in 1842 and she saw a Highland pageantry. So obviously this is your Scottish clothing, your kilts, tartans, all that kind of stuff. She really loved it. And obviously she later purchased Balmoral Estate. That's, she adopted then the Royal Stuart tartan, which is their tartan, which for anyone who is unfamiliar with tartans, every clan has a specific tartan, like a pattern.
Yeah, I have one.
You have one?
Yes.
You have one?
I do, yes.
You have a Scottish pattern?
I do.
How has this not been known to me? How did what?
Yeah, because my dad's grandparents are Scottish, so my great grandparents, and they're from the Hay clan, surname Paxton, and we have our own tartan.
Do you actually have one, or do?
Yeah, we used to wear it as children. My mum had one for her, and then 3 girls. All of us had our tartan. We'd wear it together.
That's really cool.
So yeah,
do you know where it is now, or?
No. No. But no, I remember being told as well when I was a child that it was our tartan. But yeah,
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, Queen Victoria had her tartan, you had your tartan, but the next logical step was she had to embellish this tartan with the appropriate jewellery, which was of course Scottish jewellery. So, the Cairngorm mounts have lots of agates, citrines, other quartzes, bloodstones, and they're made often into brooches, to pins, bracelets, and she used to wear these. She even wore them on a state trip to Paris, with this really popularized this Scottish type of jewellery. And this Scottish type of jewellery has become popular again.
Yeah.
In the 90s, I've heard, because, we were both only children, just entered into this world, but there was a show, an antique show in Japan at that time. And everyone always talks about, going to Japan in the 90s, right? And that show, apparently you just could not keep Scottish jewellery in the counters. Like, they're just so popular with the Japanese clientele. Even now, we still buy it if it comes into us.
There's still a hunger for it. The problem is with any Victorian jewellery, especially from the Romantic era, is condition, right? So every year things become scarcer and harder to find and harder to get, because either people haven't looked after them when they're wearing them, they haven't had it restored or checked over by their jeweler as often as they should. And we have stones missing, or we have settings that have been crushed, or we have something that's been, a beautiful 22 karat Victorian ring that's been worn up against a platinum band and it's just smoothed it away entirely. It's things like that. And with the Scottish jewellery, it is really about condition, because you have tablets of these gemstones that you're talking about that have been carved to fit settings. And they've also been matched for color. So even, the color wheel of the landscape, you'll see that with all of the Scottish jewels, even though a dark green and a red, so a bloodstone and a carnelian might be sitting next to each other, they'll actually make the tones of the colors match really well and nicely. It's very well thought out color patterns. And even if you try to replace those with something that's new, the patina of how the tablet of gemstone has worn looks really different. It looks sharp. It doesn't have this kind of porous look to it, which ruins the piece.
Yeah, I mean, the only way to do that is to actually find another old stone to put into it. It'd be like...
Which is impossible.
It'd be like if you had a tiled kitchen, say, and you somehow broke a tile, and you had it for 10 years, and you somehow broke a tile in the middle, and you had the exact same tile, it's still in the box, you took it out and you put it down in the middle, it would just stand out.
Yes.
And imagine doing that with a gemstone that was mined, 180 years ago or 50 years ago.
I've seen it done many times, and it just looks like, a jack-o'-lantern tooth.
Yeah, there's an effect in the jewellery business. I don't know if there's a word for it or not, but let's say a piece is 95% right. The piece that is 100% right might cost like double, even though it's 95% of the way there, because the ones that are super fine and in immaculate condition, they're works of art in addition to being jewellery. But
it's also, so that's her trip to the Scottish Isles. Remember, when you're courting as well, you're stepping your best foot forward. So her fashions during this time were very bright, colorful, sultry as well, because she was on the courting scene. So, and then when she was married as well, she then upped her game as well. So her gowns were extremely bright and colorful, especially as, she gets older, things turn a little bit dark and gray, not during the Romantic era. So we also see a real beautiful burst of brightness and vibrancy in the gemstones that are used during the Romantic era as well. She absolutely adored flowers. So the flower motif was used a lot on her gowns, in her own jewellery, but also to mirror, the gemstones were used to mirror the colours of flowers as well. So we see a lot of Persian turquoise being used, one of her favourite gemstones. And this can be really hard condition-wise as well, to find something that the turquoise are all the same colour and are all still intact, because it's quite a porous stone and it's a stone that you have to really look after as well. But it was used to mirror the forget-me-not flower. So we see it in sentimental jewellery throughout the Victorian age, but in particular, a real favourite of Queen Victoria during the Romantic era.
I love that turquoise jewellery from that period. Yeah. And specifically, I remember, we're talking about replacing, this jewellery has lasted 150 years, right? So it's fairly durable, right? It's just on the occasions when stones need to be replaced. Other things you'll see if you have something you're trying to date. If you have coral was so popular this time period, especially in parures. Yesterday in that private collection we were looking at, beautiful big set of kind of a fringe coral necklace with earrings and a brooch, like beautiful. It was really popular up in about 1865. So most Victorian coral jewellery will be from the Romantic period. So if you have something, chances are it's going to be from this time period. Cameos were really popular in, carved in onyx, dichoscedony, amethyst, big shell cameos, really popularized at this time.
But also remember the subject matter during the Victorian era. So we're really, cameos and things like that, super important during two of the periods that we're going to talk about. Also the Grand period, we see quite a few of the cameos come to the forefront. But we're looking for subject matter which always kind of reverts back to something that's happening at this time during her life, such as the Scottish trip, her marriage, so flowers, serpents. We're also looking at gemstones that come from specific parts of the world which are in abundance at that time, which she rules. So we see garnets, we see turquoise, we see rubies and sapphires and diamonds. But it's also the subject matter. So if we've got any kind of cameos, the cameos are usually like love themed or have some form of romanticism to them. So Cupid or Pooty are a famous Victorian romanticism motif that we see. And anything to do with flowers and any kind of love token that is this era, right? So it's always about the subject, reverting back to the subjects that she's most interested in at this time, which is anything really that's affecting her life. And during this period, it's, yes, the building up of her kingdom, but really it's the beginning of her married life. It's her courtship, it's her pre-marriage, and then her marriage, and then her children. And really what happens during this romantic era is, the honeymoon phase. We witness it through jewellery. and the amount of gifts that are given to her by her husband during this period kind of also sets the standards for men. Like, you know, this guy is buying this woman and making these tiaras for her and lockets for her and giving her engagement gifts and engagement rings. And this then is kind of projected out onto the world as something that is now, you have to do that. So it's really interesting. Thank you, Albert. We love you for it. But it's really interesting to see. And also, you know, they let people into their relationship. Like they let the world in to see and get a peep at this kind of romantic love that they have through jewelry, which he then also wants to have displayed at different exhibits as well. So it's not just she gets to wear it and feel the sentimentality of his love and these love tokens, but it also goes on display at exhibits for people, for their subjects to view as well. So it does become a huge part of culture at the time. And now it's never really left. People might think, oh, you know, we don't do that anymore. We totally do it. You know, if there's a big birthday or if there is an engagement, there's a gift.
It's just traveled through that culture has just traveled through generations, but it's not that far ago. Like it's not, for most of us, probably 4 or 5 generations, like, which is not miles. So even though you mightn't realize it, yes, he has set the standard. Other things to look out for in this time period: mother of pearl jewelry with like little tiny seed pearls. We've had a couple of them before. Multi-strand necklaces, very ornate, really quite ornamental. They wouldn't be worn very often, but
and
you will
like
see them.
Shells is another one as well, which had to do with fertility. We see quite a bit of shell jewelry that's used as well, like as a motif and as the actual material.
Both.
So, you know, to kind of show femininity and childbirth and purity.
White shells. Again, the symbolism of the shell, the colors as well. So also at this time, the French conquered or invaded Algeria. So motifs from that region, like there was, you know, crossover knots, like tasseled kind of twisted cords and rope patterns, very popular at this time. Assyrian styles is kind of what you might call it. Italian, like something that, again, one of the pieces of jewelry. We have a separate episode about it. We will talk. We'll put that in the link in the show notes in this podcast. Micro mosaics again, and that links into the travel. People going to Italy, going to Rome, seeing these things and the local crafts. Yeah,
that'll definitely go. We'll go more into depth in that in the Grand period for sure as well.
Last piece that I would say also to be aware of in the Romantic period, you start to really see mourning jewelry. And although it was really popularized once Prince Albert died in 1961, mourning jewelry is very popular. So things with jet, with onyx, are imitations of these stones. Jet, typically from the Yorkshire coast, it can be big. It was quite strong, so it would be carved into different shapes. You can typically see it in large earrings or full suites of necklaces. Also, as we mentioned, hair jewelry, which has a similar kind of aesthetic to it, is also very popular during this period. We are going to wrap it up there. I'd like to thank you all for listening to part 1 of this 3-part mini-series breaking down the Victorian era. Remember, we have notes on what we spoke about with links and anything else you might need in the description area of this podcast. As always, I'd like to thank my trusty co-host, Alyce Ketcher. Thank you, Alyce.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
And to our podcast producer, dustpod.io. But most of all, I'd like to thank anyone who's listening. And if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to contact us via Instagram at Courtville Antiques or email us at experts@courtville.ie. Until the next time, from me, Matthew Eldon, chat to you soon.